Councillor Horrell.
Chair, the whole business of measurement and verification is clearly going to become quite an industry, and the use of data to justify or not. Are we being sufficiently robust here and in the sort of validity of that data and the information that is going to be required? Because I can see that there'll be quite a lot of toing and froing, and we've heard already, haven't we, of developers who've got certain readings by, you know, going around with masking and the like, just to get the reading they need for the moment. So how can we make sure that metering, monitoring, reporting is as robust as we clearly need it to be effective? Thank you.
I think that's a really good point. I envisaged that hopefully we could come up with some kind of online template that obviously, you know, you fill in for nitrates and things like that, which could kind of, you know, there's certain fields that you have to fill in, etc., and gives you an answer rather than obviously just asking people for a document, which obviously you've got to plough through. So I think that's something we need to take away. Obviously, get the policy in place first of all, but I do think it's important because obviously we want to make sure whatever data we're getting actually tells us what we want and it's achieving the policy aim. But that's part of monitoring the policy, which picked up in the authorities monitoring report every year. But is the policy being used? How robust is it? What's happening? But I think that's a kind of takeaway once we get through this process.
Thank you. That sounds great. That we might pick that up. Thank you.
Any other questions? CN3? No. Coming on to CN4 and the surrounding information, do we have any questions on water efficiency standards in new developments? No. Okay, coming on to CN5 then, and renewable and low carbon energy schemes. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, I welcome CM 5.1, where it talks about the unacceptable impact on landscape and visual amenity, which is positive. I suppose my question that I don't see here articulated is the whole balance of sort of food production and the use of certain lands to provide space for renewable and low carbon energy schemes, and how we're balancing that. And I don't see that articulated in the policy as to how that will be considered.
But there is no reference, as quite rightly pointed out, to obviously that balance, which obviously is important, obviously in terms of obviously the climate emergency, in terms of obviously importing food, etc. But obviously we haven't said obviously we exclude grade 1, grade 2. We'd obviously each application will be judged on its own merits. But I'm struggling to think how we could incorporate that in that policy CN5, if I'm honest, about that balance. But that balance would need to be taken, and obviously clearly some of the solar farms, etc. can be used for other uses, but not obviously perhaps food production, but obviously grazing and things like that.
Could I ask then, is it possible to indicate, you know, different grades of land? Is that a meaningful aspect? Because again, that in applications historically, people raise, you know, the siting and then the alternative use of that land, which, you know, also fits the desires we have for more local production and the likes of food and the like, and less transportation. So it's just a question of whether there is a meaningful addition to that could give better guidance. Thank you.
Mr. Finch.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's one of those points, Councillor Horror, that we'll take away and think about in terms of, because I think it's clearly a very relevant point. I think overall, if we were to, and I don't have a figure, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I suspect that the number of overall the amount of the district that's been taken over by sort of solar farms or whatever, which were previously used for agricultural production, and a lot of them sites are those that are used for agricultural production. But as Adrian Fox has said, some of them actually, I've seen pictures of sheep grazing around, literally grazing around some of these. So it doesn't rule out all forms of agriculture, but clearly you wouldn't be able to have a crop. And we'll have to have a think about it. I think also depends what, because all of these policies obviously are going to have to square with national policy, NPPF. So what we can do as a takeaway, I think, is we'll look at that and see whether we can incorporate something in about loss of agricultural land, and we'll see what the NPPF says specifically in relation to this type of policy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Cutler, you had a point specifically on this.
Yeah, specifically, well, 2 points on it. One is that one's got to be very, very careful about blunt instruments about agricultural value and worth. I mean, what tends to be used at the moment is the grading system, which is about 70 years out of date and very, very, hardly relevant to the. So very often grade 4 land, well, no problem. We don't need it, but actually grade 4 land can be very productive. So using the right metrics on there is quite important. The other point I'd make is about enforcement of the sort of additions that come. So promises of biodiversity, net gain and wildflowers and other aspects of the management of the land, particularly below solar farms. Is there any mechanism for enforcing that? Because my personal experience of it is that lots of promises were made and none of it's been done. And if we're going to try and balance those two things with solar and with biodiversity, lots of promises and then no work. So is there a mechanism for enforcement?
I think that's one definitely worth noting.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think the advantage, Letty, and again, I'm looking across at my colleagues that know much more about the detail than I do, is that the advantage of that actually is rather than having some things which tend to be seen by some as add-ons, if you like, you put solar panels or whatever. Some of these things actually with Letty, I think, are designed into it. It's a whole package. So whilst I said earlier, you can't always control what white goods people, order after they've been in the property or it changes hands after 10 years or whatever. I think with the Letty standards, some of that's kind of like the performance of the building fabric, etc. is kind of designed in from the beginning. So you've got kind of more inbuilt enforcement there, but it will come down to the same as any other policy requirements we put on any planning permission, really, any condition. It comes down to enforceability. Now, clearly, it's not practical to enforce all conditions on all the planning permissions that we've got. We do enforcement and we do monitor, and we've got criteria of developments where we do that. So we will visit sites, etc., to make sure they're doing what it says on the tin, on the planning permission. But we have to be realistic, I think. And I think what the best approach to this is to use the policy standards that we're incorporating to give us the best chance of getting that benefit, that reduction over a period of time. And I think with Letty, I think a lot of that is kind of designed in from the beginning, and over time as well. The building regulations will improve. I mean, in 2025, if they stay on the current timetable, there's going to be quite a shift again in performance, fabric performance, etc. for that. So they gets picked up that way, and that covers extensions as well, of course. So I think as I say, we'll. I think that's probably the best. I don't know if anybody else. I don't know whether Mrs. Pinnock can add anything more about that, because obviously we've got policy at the moment we implement, a CP11, etc. Thank you, Chair.
I don't think I've got particularly. I think we do proactive monitoring, as well as Simon said, on some conditions. As you said, we can't do all, but if we're aware of things that aren't complying with planning conditions, we will investigate those and understand the reason and see how we can take that forward. So I think there's opportunities for both sides of that.
Councillor Laming.
Yes, I think that we need to look quite closely at policies for solar farms, and we should take note of councils that are already doing that in their provisional draft plans, like Chelmsford, which I supplied Mr. Fox with the details of that. And we do really need to look at the agricultural land that he wants to go on. We need to protect the gaps around the settlements for this, and those type of plans incorporating in the local plan does take all that into account. So we need to look at those examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Porter.
I think I'm just going to say that I know that Councillor Laming, as chairman of HEP, has been interested in looking at this as a policy issue, and the way in which we could create conditions so that they are enforceable. And that ties up with sort of comments we've been having. So yes, it is a conversation that needs to be had, but at the same time, we also need to be assertive in putting forward our plans for solar farms if we can find sites for them. It is a temporary permission after all. It's not permanent.
Thank you. I would like to see an additional point in here on, since the solar farms have started incorporating more often battery storage and the fires that come alongside some of those battery storages. And I know there was a case up in Liverpool where the fire was so fierce that the fire brigade couldn't even get close to it until it died down. So I wonder if we could have an extra point in here to ask for an emergency plan. Any other questions on CN5? Okay, we'll come on to CN6 then. No questions on CN6? CN7. No? Is there anything else in this section that we've missed? Any further comments? Okay, so that concludes the carbon neutrality section. So just to summarise for you the points we've got to take away. Put in a specific section about LETI because it's so important to the fundamental thinking of this policy. Take away to look at applying CN1 to extensions. Look at how to measure CN3 after the consultation. Under CN5, we've got to balance versus food sustainability and farming, agricultural land, noting that it's an outdated measure. Worth ensuring, so using the correct metrics and look at this whole piece further. Mechanisms for enforcing promises of recycling and all the promises that they make at the start, and to add an additional requirement for an emergency plan document to be incorporated. Anything I've missed? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Chair, can I just, in relation to CN5, in terms of the measurement and verification, what I was actually saying was, I think we need to get the policy through the process first, and then think about obviously the perhaps online techniques that we have about the verification, because I don't think there's any point in developing that yet, because the policy hasn't got any weight. So I think it's post adoption.
So I'll stick the words after consultation in there, yes, or after implementation?
After adoption.
After adoption. Everybody happy with that amendment? Okay. Thank you. Moving on to high quality and well designed places, I believe we're going to Toby Ailing to introduce this section. Thank you, Toby.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. This section really is trying to do three main things in the local plan. By way of reference, it's on pages 44 to 83 of the plan document itself, or 85 to 124 of your agenda packs. It certainly isn't mine anyway. There's three main elements to it. First is picking up really the new emphasis on design in national policy and ensuring that Winchester has the best framework for ensuring quality places and design under this local plan. So it's picking up things such as the National Design Guide and Model Code, what that means and how we deal with that here in Winchester, and in particular sort of how to follow the main thread hopefully running through this chapter, that design is a process, that actually derives a quality outcome that we're seeking. And in particular, listing for the 10 characteristics of good design, what they mean in the Winchester context. So that guidance is there for developers and others to see what we're looking for. That's the first element. The second element is that we are conscious, obviously, there's a lot of work existing and is still continuing in things like village design statements, neighbourhood plans, design codes, as well as the vision for Winchester work. And the aim, what we've tried to do through the policies for Winchester Town, South Hampshire, and for the market towns and rural areas, is to set out a framework for how that work we can draw on existing work and documents in place now, and provide a framework for future documents to come forward to actually flesh out and add further local value on what is important in those areas. And if I may, I did notice the comments from one of the public speakers earlier about this question of how far we go on Winchester Town in this plan and whether we've quite got the balance right. And at the moment, we think the plan reflects, if you like, the progress made with the Winchester vision work. And we do think it does offer those hooks for further work to undertake without actually specifying whether that is, in the case of Winchester Town, a whole Winchester approach or a neighbourhood approach, which I know is also something that has been discussed and no doubt be a point that will be returned to as the plan progresses. And the third point is just there are also a series of more detailed design policies towards the end of the chapter covering specific issues that have been in previous local plans, such as design, shop fronts and signage, that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Much appreciated. Councillor Rutter?
Yes, I'd just like to ask if under 5.4 it talks about community engagement, and it says community engagement is also integral to the design process that leads to a better informed scheme which identifies and addresses local issues. Could I just plead that that is given a much bigger role within the almost instructions to developers, because in my experience, far too often developers go through all the process of talking to our design people at the City Council and so on. And then they come up with a plan, they have it all ready, and then they say, right, now we're going to consult with the community, by which time it's all far too late for anything to be changed because they've put a lot of time, effort and money into producing it. So can we just make sure that that community engagement element is clear to developers, and that it comes at a stage which is early enough for community engagement to mean what it says, in that the community can be engaged and at a stage where they can make changes. Otherwise it's pointless.
Mr. Fox, Mr. Finch, is that something that we can specify as part of our planning process? I mean, it's essential, but is it something we can specify?
I was wondering actually on page it's 55, which I've got the right page, so I'm looking at a paper version. There's a design-led approach diagram, 96, thank you. I'm wondering whether or not in that diagram there we could perhaps include an additional leaf or whatever you call it in there to make sure that point's clear, because I think it all comes down to the design-led approach, and including obviously local communities in that is essential. And I think obviously that would probably fit there better, would be my suggestion.
With respect, perhaps a little bit more beefing up would be good. A bit more, you know, its own paragraph or something, just to give it a bit more welly. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rutter. So we're coming to questions on background information, the pre-information, before we come to the policies on this one. Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say, please, it's actually really important, this. So yes, I agree, an extra leaf, but I totally 110% agree with Councillor Rutter here. You know, that whether it's neon lights, it needs to be bolder. We need more community engagement at an emerging plan for these developers. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. Any questions on the background information, the pre-information before the policies? Councillor Horrell.
Chair, on the table that gives the 10 elements of good design set out in the National Design Guide, I just a technical point. It says under lifespan made to last, we've got a Winchester vision, the existing local evidence. I didn't know that we had a Winchester vision. I thought we had a Winchester town vision. I didn't know that we had a Winchester vision.
Sorry, what section was that in? So I can put it down
That
as
is in the table of the 10 characteristics on page 95 of our report pack.
Mr. Finch.
I think it just needs to be corrected. I think it means the City of Winchester vision. Thank you, councillor, for drawing our attention to that. Thanks.
Any further questions on this early part? We'll come to the policies. Right, okay, so we come to policy D1 then. The strategic policy, high quality and wide inclusive places. Oh,
Sorry.
Councillor Horrell.
Apologies, Chair. Whilst COVID has taught us that we need space at home to work, in the key issues on design, on page 91 of our report pack, it says that homes should be large enough for everyone of working age to work from home. And elsewhere in the report, we talk about smaller homes and preserving them, and that balance of small and then large enough for people not only to live but to work at home. And I just, those key issues that are here to be addressed, whether that skews us on the type and style of housing that is brought to the table, if we're saying that everyone of working age should be able to work at home. Just a question. Well, how can we balance that across all our housing needs?
If I may, I think there is a tension there, because the retaining a stock of smaller homes is an important part of the overall housing market. I think the current plan has two approaches. One is specifying which we have. If we want to achieve them, we have to specify here the national minimum space standards, so that new properties meet certain space criteria, which are larger than some market dwellings have been providing in the past. And the second bit is, though, the other side of that coin is retaining a stock of smaller dwellings in rural areas in particular, but across potentially the plan area, to ensure that that element of work is fulfilled. If we go perhaps a more different approach, which would be, for instance, for a larger, a more relaxed approach to increasing numbers of rooms in dwellings, then we're really talking about a different housing element of the housing market there, and we wouldn't necessarily be meeting those needs for people for a smaller, potentially cheaper product. So that's how we've approached it in this plan anyway. So we think we've got new buildings are of a certain size, but we do think that a number of properties with a smaller number of bedrooms is still important to retain in certain areas. So I hope that's helped explain where we're at anyway.
Thank you, Toby. Councillor Porter.
So I'm at risk of asking a question here then. So are we saying that we only accept houses with the national space standards and that we won't accept anything less than the space standards? Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding. Yeah, that's how we square the circle of this conversation.
Forgive me, Chair. Yes, I mean, the policy would be to seek national minimum space standards, and that's pretty much a given, unless there are specific circumstances which would want a different approach, but that is by exception. and absolutely by exception. Advise, for instance, conversion of listed buildings may provide the sort of circumstances where that may be considered, but it would be certainly by exception in that case. Forgive me.
I just wanted to say my concern over is by exception, and how developers like to play on exceptions in that sort of circumstance. I know 2 years ago we saw some housing coming through that were below the minimum standards. It was rejected and they did rethink it and they did come back, but just exceptions is quite a tricky one to be strict on. Councillor,
if I can assist there, Chair, I mean, there are examples where we would definitely consider.
We can't manage to make these both.
Right, there are definitely situations, for example, where you have small units for single people, which may well have elements of shared laundry and shared community space which go along. So overall, the unit might be quite small, but actually the amount of space available to the residents of that building are appropriate. And certainly we have already allowed some of those examples to be built in the city.
okay, thank you for the clarification, Councillor Loney. Any other points on policy D1? Councillor Westwood, then Councillor Krask.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to refer back to Councillor Rutter's comments about community engagement. So I had a quick flick through all the policies here, and if I look in policy D4, there is an explicit paragraph about community engagement, but that's the only place I can find a policy around community engagement. My question is, should that point be applicable to all of our policy, our development areas and design areas, not just market towns and rural villages, so on?
Mr. Finch?
Yeah, I think the difficulty comes, I mean, we would absolutely 100% advocate what you've said. And to be honest, it's in the developer's interest actually to try to get some sort of consensus by speaking and engaging properly with the community. And that is definitely part of a good design process. My only concern is that if you make it a policy requirement, because clearly it's coming through, hopefully very clearly in the supporting text to the policies, if all that was wrong with the scheme, let's say I'm sort of playing devil's advocate, was the fact they hadn't unfortunately engaged properly with the community, I'm not sure you could sustain a reason for refusal purely on that basis if the scheme on its planning, other planning merits was acceptable. And that's my only question. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to make it clear, and we can add that into the leaves as we've discussed on page 55 of the plan, 96 of the papers, and really ran that home. And I'd absolutely advocate that. In fact, when we talk to developers at the pre-application stage, it's one of the first things that the planners will say, you really do need to engage with the community, including your parish, your ward councils, etc., etc. If they choose not to do it, I'm just not convinced, and I think my colleague Mrs. Pinnock, who deals with the application on a regular basis, is nodding. I just don't think we could require it to be refused simply because they hadn't done that part of the process, even though we would strongly advocate that they should have done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Finch. Councillor Westwood?
Thank you. Could you then explain why it's part of policy D4 and not in the other policy areas for different areas of development? So it is in D4. What I'm saying is only in D4.
Yeah,
but you're saying
he's going to respond,
Yeah,
Councillor Westwood.
I think you'll find it's in policy D2.3 how community engagement has been used. It's in point 4 on D3 and point 4 on D4. So we've included it in all those policies, but obviously the strategic policy is more overarching.
Thank you. Any, Councillor Krask, we were coming to you next.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of D1, I'd like to thank officers for the work they've done to engage with people around Winchester for that design collaboration. There was some great work with Design Southeast, has been mentioned, and I'm really grateful for the work that's gone into this local plan to reflect the unique requirements of the town as a whole and the complexity of the town. And I think that shows up in the comments that Toby made and in the paper as a whole. I do struggle though that the policies refer to the need to do more. So for example, 5.48 speaks to the need as a starting point for the preparation of local area design codes. And Toby, you mentioned this. I think what these policies speak to is the need to do more. And the diagrams, as Mr. Hearn spoke about when he spoke, the diagrams reflect the engagement that was done with people around the areas of opportunity, but it evidenced the work that still needs to be done in a structured way to build on and develop out those areas of opportunity and to develop those into a citywide urban design framework. But it's got to be based on the movement strategy. So what it speaks to is more work that needs to be done to define design codes, to define policies for the different areas across the city.
Sorry, Councillor Crass, can I ask you to try and define this as what your question is or what it is you feel should be changed before this goes to consultation, as opposed to what might be feedback as part of consultation?
Thank you, Chair. There's certainly feedback around consultation. I'm struggling with, are these policies? Is my question. Do we have policies here? Is D1 a policy, or is it describing a process that still needs to be done?
Maybe.
If I may, when we talk about D1, really it absolutely sort of is supposed to set out that process by which we expect any development to come forward and for it to be considered through consideration of the characteristics, the constraints, the opportunities, all that. So D1 is all about the process. I think, if I may, Councillor, it's possibly D2, 3 and 4, which are about the different places around the district, and D2, for instance, on Winchester Town. That's where if you like, the policy, what we expect to happen in Winchester, for example, that's much more of a policy, not a process. The arguments and consideration about how far and how detailed that goes, I would suggest that the moment reflects where we're at in that discussion about Winchester Town. But it's because we talk so often about design as a process, we're trying to hammer that home, that plan. Although it is important to make the point that D1 is all about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. There was another question on here. Was it Councillor Rutter or Councillor Cutler that had your hand up? No? Any other questions on Councillor Porter?
Just to say, I acknowledge that there's a debate going on about this and we need to get this right for the town forum's sake as well as the community's sake. So I am very happy to continue this conversation. I've already had a conversation with City of Winchester Trust as well. And this is something that I'm very happy for you to write down. Action, JP.
Okay, so you'd like an action to take this away and speak to City and Winchester Trust?
Absolutely, and I understand completely that it's something that's raised frequently with Councillor Crask as chairman of the town forum, and he feels very strongly about this too.
Okay. Councillor Todd.
Yeah, I just wanted to double check something for understanding, because I think it'd be useful to clarify, which is there was a question earlier about hooks, and do we offer policy hooks in order to add extra planning documents further down the road? Am I right in understanding that's basically D22? Is that is the hook paragraph that says if you've got one of these policies, we're deliberately creating space to say this is where you can hook in a policy, and if that policy exists, then it needs to be followed. Is that me understanding correctly what you're saying there? What's the intent of that?
Councillor Todd, that we are opening up for more granular, if I call it that, work to be undertaken at a more local level as and when that comes forward. So we are basically saying, because with an SPD, you have to have a main policy, parent policy to hook against it. So that is exactly it. So we are opening the door to further granular work.
So we've got a D2 and I think in D3 and in D4, we're essentially saying across the entire district, we've created what you might call a hook paragraph so that we're giving ourselves the space, whether it's a village, whether it's the whole of Winchester, whatever it is you try to do, that is where we give people the policy space to be able to add in whatever the extra policy document might be. That's the paragraph that does it, just so that, because I know that that is an area of concern for people, and I think just everybody being clear that that is what it is, and if they have questions as to whether it does the job well enough, we can discuss that, but fundamentally that's where it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Any further questions on policy D1? No. Okay. Moving on to policy D2 then. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down to it. So design principles for Winchester Town. Do we have any specific comments on that? No. D3, design principles for South Hampshire urban areas. No, my only comment here would be, please can we have some? Just based on the ugly flats on my development that are notorious throughout the area. That would be my only comment on that policy. Strategic policy D4, Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chair. On item 2, where it refers to other documents such as village design statements, is there any way that we can put in some wording that says that they are current, up-to-date versions? Because members of the planning committee around this table will know that some of the documents were published in 2002 and possibly even before in some. I think they need to be updated or in fact reviewed, and a review date put on them, because what we don't want is people still referring to out-of-date documents that don't actually marry up with the local plan. And I think that is the important aspect. So is there any way we can introduce a little bit in brackets said it's got to be an up-to-date or in line with the local plan, the current local plan?
I think it's a good point. I think the only problem is obviously my understanding of up to date, and perhaps your understanding of up to date might be difficult. So it's just trying to think of the words that we could use in that policy, because is it 2 years, 5 years? What is that period? So I think that's something we'd need to take away and have a think about.
Yeah, it's more or less so it says it's in line with the current plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. Any other questions on policy D4? Councillor Horrell.
Chair, are we missing conservation area appraisals here, which do obviously have content that would influence design in the market towns and rural villages?
Mr. Fox.
We'll take that point away. Thank you.
Many thanks. Any further questions on D4? Councillor Cutler.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that actually it says any relevant aspects, and it's really about defining that relevance in terms of time, isn't it? So Councillor Reid was talking about an outdated plan. It's no longer relevant, but how does one define that? But that's probably again more a consultation comment than a technical comment on this.
Thank you, Councillor Cutler. Any further questions on D4? No. D5, master plan, Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Under little f, could I suggest, and we've already spoken to some extent on this car parking, the car usage, could I suggest that after the word including, you put current provision for local transport, and followed
Councillor
by,
Reid, is that a technicality you could email across?
Sorry?
Is that a technicality you could email across? Is that something you could email across?
I can do
correction?
quite easily.
Is that
Yes.
okay?
Yeah, it's not on my original list.
If you can send through that additional, that would be helpful. Thank you, Councillor Reid. Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Chair. I've also got one that I think that's a technical wording, and that's on strategic policy D5. the
Again,
master
can you
plan.
email that across?
And I'm emailing it to Toby. Okay, did anybody, for the point of now, do you want to know what it is?
No,
No? Okay, fine. Thank you.
but thank you. Councillor Horrell.
Chair, whilst I admire in the policy, I question completely the implementation of that timely delivery of physical infrastructure. We know already that we've had sites not make the plan because of some of these things. So how are we, Winchester, going to ensure that that can be addressed in any master plan? Please.
Who would like to pick up that? Councillor Todd?
That's why we have the policy. We don't have the policy at the moment, and so that people don't deliver things in a timely way. And what we're saying is that we need a guarantee. We need, when complex master plans get agreed, part of that is at planning stage, and without it, plans not being agreed, to say that there is timely delivery of the infrastructure that's needed. If more clarity is needed on that, it's open for discussion. But the purpose of adding the policy is that we don't have the policy, and we've had issues, and everybody knows the issues at King's Barn, where the sequencing of delivery has been out to lunch, frankly, versus the need of the site. And so quite consciously and deliberately, a policy has been added to give us the mechanisms to be able to have those conversations with developers and ensure that things are delivered in a timely way as sites are built out.
As I said, I'm not anti the policy point. I think I question timely, as Councillor Porter and I know we represent an area where timely could be 5-10 years. So it is not. These are elements that I think we need to perhaps have a little more clarity around. Is there, what does timely delivery mean if we are absolutely advocating that?
Can I just respond? And actually, Councillor Horrell, you'll know that that wasn't a master plan, but because of that, that whole plan has been abandoned. So until we are certain exactly, not abandoned, but certainly left until we are certain. So that sentence is there, particularly for this, but it's actually there for every development that is in place.
Mr. Finn?
I think, but what it does is, I think, as Councillor Toller said, it's making it a requirement for the people doing the master plan, which often won't be the city council, it'll be the developer, to address those issues in particular. And really, they need to do they need to do the work on that and then present that as part of the master plan to the city council. I think that's the point it's making. And if you don't put it in there, they should do it anyway, but they may not do it. So if they're making it an explicit reference, we would expect them to engage with the relevant statutory undertakers or whomever, and then to put that into the master plan that they're then putting forward to support that site. I think that's the point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Finch. Any further questions on D5? No. D6 then, brownfield development and making the best use of land. Does anybody have any questions on that section? Councillor Horrell.
In what are we aiming for? It says very clearly in this document that the housing requirements will necessitate the release of greenfield land, and yet we have brownfield sites that have not made the plan that seem to be perfectly reasonable. I'm struggling to understand why, even though at the beginning of this document we articulated our desire for brownfield first, we haven't chosen all of the possible brownfield sites that we might have done.
Mr. Fox?
I think if you're talking about specific sites, maybe we need to talk about that under the site section rather than obviously here, in terms of obviously we feel that we have explored the brownfield opportunities in the district, but obviously if there's a specific site that you think should be allocated that we haven't allocated, I think that's a separate conversation rather than that particular point there, I think.
Okay, we'll pick that up more this afternoon when we talk about allocations. Councillor Horrell.
Can I then just clarify, given the numbers question we had earlier, Could we meet all of the Winchester requirements without using Greenfield? I.e. not having the buffer?
Can we pick this up as a general allocations conversation this afternoon? If that's okay, councillor Hall.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, it doesn't relate to a site. It's just a general question about the numbers. Thank you.
Yeah, the principle of the allocations we'll pick up this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to policy D7, development standards. Do we have any questions on D7? No. D8 on page 120, contaminated land. Any questions on that policy? No, coming on to D9 then on page 122, impact of overheating. Councillor Reid, did you
Sorry,
have
did
a
you
hand
say
up?
D9?
D9, impact
Thank
of
you very much.
overheating.
I agree in principle with the proposal. However, just one question: how can we monitor or enforce it in the long term?
Mr. Fox, is that for you?
I think obviously we're asking obviously as an energy carbon statement in policy CN1 to obviously demonstrate what they're doing, but obviously it is a question of obviously enforcing it. But I think with obviously what we're trying to do is obviously balance it to make sure that you don't have to use mechanical ventilation in your home, which obviously nowadays is going to cost you a lot of money with the rising cost of energy. So I think it's in everybody's interest, particularly during this hot summer, to have a ventilated house, because otherwise you're going to have to pay money to actually obviously cool yourself down. So I think it will be self-regulating in terms of obviously the cost that it is actually going to cost people because of rising energy costs. So I think it will be regulated. It certainly is on my agenda.
Thank you. Councillor Learning?
Thank you. The policy specifically excludes household applications and changes of use. Do we need to have something a bit more proactive in here in encouraging something more encouraging about the use of passive methods of preventing overheating? I say this as somebody who was told I couldn't have solar shades on my house because it would be out of keeping with the rest of the development, which, as I live in a very standard suburban area, that seemed a bit harsh to me.
I put up a pergola with a wisteria to prevent the need for that. Mr. Fox?
I think that's picked up in point 2, really, about obviously how you deal with overheating in terms of that point. Obviously, we've got covered by vegetation, that's covered by that, fenestration. We've got obviously a picture on the page before about obviously the Winchester University, about how they've dealt with it. And I think obviously that's it. It comes down to the design process, really, recognising that temperatures are rising.
Yeah, I think my point was about retrofit and whether we're actually encouraging that.
Shall I put a note in to look at that? Yep. Okay, any further on D9, or can we move to D10? D10 then, shop fronts. Any questions on that? No. D11 then, signage. Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chair. The 5.1 or 100, it says that advertisements will not normally be permitted on banners or hoardings, but does that include A-boards? Because that is a problem around the district.
You turn off your microphone, Councillor Evans.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Fox. Mr. Finch.
Yeah, thank you, councillor. I think that's, I mean, I think that's refers specifically to banners or hoardings, and obviously A-boards, as we know, are something slightly different. But there are, I mean, they can be what's called deemed consent, as you know, where they wouldn't need a grant of consent from the council under the advert regulations, but a lot of them will do. And the other way to tackle it, of course, is a lot of them are left out on the highway, and it's Hampshire that will deal with that. So if it becomes a problem, they would pick that up, and regardless of whether or not it requires advert consent from the authority. So I don't know that that's specifically talking about A boards, because that, fun enough, that they're actually up at 599. Advanced warning signs, A boards with freestanding boards will be permitted only where they conform to the city council, and it goes on to explain and qualify. So I think it's making a distinction for sort of banner signs that they tie to stuff, and the A boards you put on the footways in a lot of cases. So there's a distinction between 599 and 500. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I come back on that? If I take Wickham Square, which is, where I live, that is the trend. The trend is to advertise on A boards everywhere, and it's not controlled at all. So if you're saying that, Simon, that it is controlled, then I would challenge that, because the latest trend is to have an A board outside saying fish and chips today or something.
Well, it may not be. I mean, there may be an issue, is what I would say, and what I was explaining was the fact that sometimes they do need permission, and they will also need permission to be on the highway if they're on highway land. So there is recourse. We could look at that, but that's really an enforcement issue, and we can pick that up, councillor. So if there is a growth of those, then once one person does it, you often see 3, 4, or 5 other businesses do the same thing. And we've had that in Winchester, and we've met that head on, working with the bid, and also with Hampshire Highways. If there's an issue in the square at Wickham, then we'd be happy to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finch. Any further questions on policy D11? Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Under D11, we talk about internal lighting, illuminated signs in conservation areas, but what about lit signs throughout? There's no directional sign whether the lights go up or lights go down, unless this is somewhere else in the pack I haven't noticed.
We'll take that one away to look at.
Just to add, Chair, as well, I think we've got, and it may need a refresh, but we have got design guidance on signage. I think that's right, isn't it, Mrs. Pennant? We've got some specific design guidance that covers off signs, particularly in Winchester Town, which is where there's more detail in that. I think this is the policy that, again, we try to hang those things off, but that's right, I think, isn't it?
That's right, and it is referenced in the policy as well in D11, isn't it?
Thank you. Okay, let me summarise the points we've got on this section. So additional instruction in design approach, make a bigger point that community engagement should be earlier in the process to design homes. Table of 10 characteristics should be City of Winchester Vision, not Winchester Vision. Continue the conversation on D1 with the town forum, etc., as it's important that we get this right. D4, ensuring we only refer to updated village design statements, etc. Define what up-to-date might mean. Think about that. And the conservation area appraisals to be included. D9, to look at retrospective measures under this policy also. And D11, take away to look at internal lit signs. Anything I've missed? No. Okay, so we are going to break at 1:15, so that gives us another 20 minutes. So we will move on to the transport piece. I'm aware that we've already discussed this earlier on, so I'm hoping that, as it's a shorter section anyway, straight over to you, Jill, for a brief intro.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, taking into account climate change and the need to reduce the carbon footprint, then I think you'll notice this local plan, there's a significant move towards promoting sustainable modes of transport, and that's including public transport and also active travel, so walking, cycling, along those lines. Anything that has a low impact on the environment. So also including low emission cars and e-vehicles in this as well. A new thing in the transport section this time is a focus on 15-minute neighbourhoods and looking at examples throughout the district where we can possibly do that. It may not be possible everywhere, but the aim is to reduce the need for people to get into their cars to go and travel either to schools, to get your shopping, or even to work. There's also emphasis on design in terms of where we are providing roads and car parking, how they can be better suited to not be detrimental in environmental terms and visual terms. And we're aiming to move away from minimum car standards and including a policy where we are offering to look at planning applications that could come forward in highly sustainable locations with no parking provision at all, if that's appropriate. So that's a very brief summary for you. Thank you.
Councillor Learning?
Yes, I just wanted to make a few points, which partly shows how quickly these things can go out of date. In the in the section 6.4, on page 126 or 85 for those who have paper copies, we refer to the various strategies which are currently which we've currently agreed. But the City of Winchester Local Cycling and Walking Infrastructure Plan is actually already being reviewed, and we're expecting a new version of that in early 2023. We're also currently working on the district LC whip, which will need to be mentioned in here, and we're expecting that to be consulted on in the late spring. So there's already quite a lot of work going. So those will need to be included as we go through the plan process.
Thank you, Councillor Learning. Councillor Lamy?
Whilst I appreciate the desire for 15-minute and public transport, are we going to be able to persuade Stagecoach to look at the routes around the city to make sure that they're more up to date, because these go back to the 1960s? And if we look at certain areas of my ward, we don't have a bus service, and that's major population areas. And also we've got parts of Stanmore only get a bus every day or so if they're lucky. We need to have a coherent transport policy for public transport to actually push this through.
Thank you, Councillor Langling. I think that in part refers to the ongoing conversations we discussed earlier in the day. So that's being looked at, and I think you said earlier that you're putting in the policy to make those conversations happen rather than the other way around. Do we have any questions on the background information before we come to the policies? Councillor Reid?
There is the word to move away from our minimum standards. Already within the planning committee, there have been numerous complaints from parish councils and local members with regarding to the number of car parking spaces. Basically, where there is either a very limited bus service or there is no bus service. And by putting in minimum standards and reducing those, yet again, will, as I said earlier, create a larger problem on the street, in the road itself, and may cause more serious problems.
Living on an MDA, it is indeed the biggest cause of arguments, contentions, neighbourhood disputes. Without,
I was thinking of the road as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're saying is we're not saying, as I explained earlier, Councillor Reid, that no parking, and that would only be suitable in the most sustainable locations. It wouldn't make sense in Denmead or where you don't have necessarily a regular access to bus service. I mean, it's not just about access to public transport, which is important, but also it's access to local services, schools, shops, etc. That can be a way to reduce the need for people to jump in a car and drive 10 minutes to get a takeaway or go to the corner shop. So that's equally important as access to public transport. But as I said earlier, what a developer will now need to do, whereas at the moment you could just look at a standard and apply it rigidly. Or what we're saying is we want to move to a point where they need to be able to explain the parking approach they've taken to that development. And we would not expect the parking approach in central Winchester to be the same as it was in Denmead or Wickham or Alresford necessarily, where clearly the potential, depending on where the site's located, may be that, you know, inevitably, even if you don't put spaces and design them in, and it's better to design them in because you can get a better quality development overall by designing them in the best way you can, you would just lead to operational problems, and that doesn't help anybody. But what we are saying is you will need to be able to explain and justify the approach you've taken on that application under that policy. Thank you, Chair.
Would it not then be more sensible to say this is our minimum in areas where there is no access to public transport and the 15-minute area community isn't achievable? Because otherwise, how do you hold developers to a minimum?
I think you have to look at where the site is located, but even within a settlement sometimes, because sometimes even if you're in the same settlement, you might not be in such an accessible location depending on where the site lies within it. And if it's Winchester, for example, although most of Winchester is still quite accessible for most things. So I think that's the point. What we're trying to say is we want developers to basically to explain, rather than just simply, well, I've done X, Y, and Z because that's what your policy said, I've just followed it to the script. What we're saying is really is that you need to, depending on the mix, the housing mix, the type of tenures, the design, the location, all of those factors that will inform the design. And then we're saying is, well, you need to say, if you come up with a scheme for 9 dwellings, but you have 25 spaces, we would probably say, well, why do you think you need that? If they'd come up with 9 houses with no spaces in Bishop's Waltham or Wickham or a less sustainable location, we would probably say, well, we need to look at the impact of that then potentially on the surrounding road network, because if you're not providing any parking, how is that going to work? Because you're not in the most sustainable location. So all I think we're trying to do is say it's horses for courses, really. And we want to make the developers do that work and say, you know, we have devised a strategy. The result of the strategy is this, but make sure we get it designed in from the beginning. And that's really important in terms of going back to the previous chapter, which is about achieving good design and not having bolt-ons afterwards. I hope that, yeah, thank you, Chair.
It just feels as though if they can come up with good justification, then they could cause longer term issues because we haven't said this is our minimum requirement for that area. And that I just feel is a concern. That's all. Councillor Porter, you wanted. Councillor Loney.
Yes, that same point.
Yeah, several of us in this room actually made a very interesting trip to Cambridge to look at a development, and including Councillor Horrell, where actually they were forced by the local district council to have more parking spaces than they actually wanted to build, and were actively taking parking spaces out of the development because they were clearly unneeded, and actually they'd identified a shortage of cycling space. So they were introducing bigger bike shelters. So I think that really shows that you do have to be quite careful about setting those minimum standards. I mean, certainly from my point of view, I think we do need to be flexible on this. And in some areas, it will be appropriate to be asking the developer for more. And I think that's easier if we haven't just set a benchmark and to say this is what we expect. But absolutely take on board the point that in areas with very poor public transport and very poor access to services, it is inevitable that we need to provide a decent number of parking spaces for people.
Councillor Reid. Sorry, Councillor Ford, hold on. Did you say you wanted to speak after?
I just wanted to also to point out that the use of a personal car is not necessarily essential. Barton Farm has got in a relatively small area, very close by, there's a car that people can hire for a very short amount of time. So I'm not suggesting that that's a solution for everybody, but to take really active measures to think about ways in which people can cycle easily to do a trip rather than on a busy road, so that they've got a dedicated cycling lane. They may just make that choice to go to school on a bike with a child on the front rather than taking a road. So it's all part of the design of the development, which is about trying to find ways to reduce their own carbon footprint, genuinely.
Noted. Sorry, Councillor Reid.
Just to say, Chair, part of the problem is that the designated car space, i.e. the garage, has generally become a very large shed.
And it's not wide enough to get your car in, which is an issue I raised long ago, as Julie Pinnock will testify to. Okay, any other questions on the background information? Then we'll come to the specific policies. Policy T1, sustainable and active transport and travel. We've already covered some of this. Does anybody have any specific questions on this section? No? Okay, policy T2, parking for new developments. Again, we've just discussed most of this. Policy T3, promoting sustainable travel modes. We've covered some of this today as well already. Any other questions on this section? Councillor Cook.
Sorry, Chair. Can I go back to T2? I made a note in my notes here about when developers are building properties. We talked about car parking spaces for the people that live there, but sometimes, you know, you have visitors, and they don't seem to be making any allowances for visitors. So I just wondered. Some of the wording in T2, is that something that could be looked at to make a developer understand it's not necessarily just the people that are living there? And I know we've talked today about, you know, making it more individual, but they do need to understand that, especially in rural areas. Because I could take you to new housing estates. One that's very close to my heart is Colden Common. That particular piece of land went from 79 homes to 179 by a change of builder. Same plot of land, but they managed to build X amount of houses in. That was a choice that was made. But the amount of spaces for visitors, they're parking all over the pavements. So that concerns me. It really does. So I feel that that's something that does need to be addressed somewhere in the wording, if it's possible.
I think this is one we should take away and look at if you're happy with that, Jill. And I certainly know that visitor parking in the MDAs is used as permanent parking spaces, and one of them scratched out the V and has had it changed and sold their house saying that was their personal parking space. But I think that that's one that we should take away and look at. So we're on T3. Any questions on T3? And then on to T4. Are we all just too hungry and trying to get to lunch now? Access for new developments. Any questions on T4? No. Any other questions?
Sorry.
Councillor Cook.
T3, there's a point here on page 135. It refers to permeable parking surfaces rather, unless there are overriding evidence reasons that prevents their use. Could somebody help me on that, please? I'm not really sure what that is referring to. I know it's parking surface, but is it the materials that are being used, why they're being used?
Mr. Fink.
Definition?
You're absolutely right, Councillor Cook. It's generally the materials that are being used, and the various materials that you can use. I mean, some are obviously permeable, others actually don't look permeable, but actually are quite permeable, or incorporate a design that enables that to happen. But there could, by exception, I suppose, if you were in a particular in an area, I suppose, where there was a particular drainage issue, where you've got a clay soil, it's a high water table or something where it may not work, so you would design something in to take the water away. But in the vast majority of cases, to be honest, you know, that's what you would want, is part of sort of a, you know, sustainable urgent drainage systems, etc., swales and all those sort of things. You have permeable surfaces. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, again, one more call for T4 or any additional comments on this section. Right, okay. In that case, we will break there 7 minutes before planned. We have 4 policies that we didn't get to this morning, 4 sections: biodiversity, historic environment, homes for all, and creating a vibrant economy. So we won't come straight to that when we come back this afternoon, because people who are speaking this afternoon are expecting to speak about allocations. So we will pause that there, have our public speaker on allocations when we come back, and we need to sit and be ready for 2. Have our public speakers, we will then do allocations, and then we'll revert back to those 4 sections, if we may. So enjoy your lunch and see you at 2 o'clock.